A cold wind cut through the empty park, rustling the leaves that had begun to gather where the little wooden bench used to be. Sarah pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, her breath escaping in uneven bursts as she stared at the vacant patch of ground. The absence of that simple, unassuming bench felt louder than a scream. Mark stood beside her, fists clenched, jaw tight. The man had always been steady, a pillar of reason even in their darkest days, but tonight even he looked shaken. His gaze was fixed on the broken slats of wood stacked haphazardly beside a trash bin, the remnants of something that had meant everything to them. Sarah forced herself to move forward, her boots crunching against the gravel as she knelt down. Her hands trembled as she picked up one of the shattered pieces of wood, her fingertips tracing the faint outline of carved letters, * Ethan's bench star. The letters were jagged now, splintered where the plaque had been forcibly removed. Her throat tightened. Ethan had been their world. Their little boy with an infectious giggle, a stubborn streak that rivaled his father's, and a heart so big it felt impossible that it had simply stopped one day. The accident had taken him, ripped a hole through their lives that no amount of time could repair. So they built this bench. Not a grand memorial, not a towering statue, just a place where people could sit, breathe, remember. A place where his spirit could linger in the laughter of children playing nearby, in the warmth of the sun filtering through the trees, in the quiet moments where life felt still. And now it was gone. Mark exhaled sharply and turned away, his hands raking through his hair. Sarah could feel the anger radiating from him, but what was there to do? They both knew who was responsible. There had been no warning, no discussion, just an abrupt, heartless erasure. The neighborhood's self-appointed dictator, Karen Weller, had made her stance on the matter clear months ago. This is a shared community space, she had snapped at the last HOA meeting, her thin lips curling into a smirk. We can't just have random benches popping up wherever people feel sentimental. Rules are rules. Sarah had tried to reason with her. It's not just a bench. It's for Ethan. Karen had sighed dramatically, tapping her manicured nails against the table as though she could barely stand to waste another moment on the conversation. I understand you're grieving truly, but personal memorials set a bad precedent. Next thing you know we'll have fountains, statues, who knows what else. This is a neighborhood, not a graveyard. The words had hit like a slap. The board had hesitated, murmured among themselves, but no one had spoken up in their defense. Karen had been running the HOA for years, using her position to manipulate, control, and bully anyone who dared challenge her. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was enjoying it. Sarah had walked out of that meeting feeling sick, but she and Mark hadn't backed down. They had gathered signatures, spoken with neighbors, even offered to cover any upkeep costs. And for a time nothing had happened. Until tonight. A soft cough made Sarah look up. Mrs. Dunlap, their elderly neighbor from 2 houses down, stood a few feet away wringing her hands. I saw them do it, she whispered. Late last night. A couple of those HOA men with power tools. Karen was standing there, supervising like some kind of queen. Sarah swallowed hard, her hands curling into fists. Mark turned to Mrs. Dunlap, his voice low. Did anyone say anything? The older woman glanced around nervously before shaking her head. Most of us are afraid. Well, you know how she is. Her expression softened as she touched Sarah's arm. I'm so sorry, dear. It's not right. Not right. That was an understatement. A few more neighbors gathered nearby, their expressions ranging from sympathetic to guilty. They had all known. Maybe some of them had even watched it happen. But in the end, no one had dared to stand up to Karen. Sarah let out a shaky breath and looked at Mark. His face was unreadable, but the tension in his shoulders told her everything she needed to know. They couldn't let this go. Karen thought she had won. But she had no idea who she was dealing with. The fluorescent lights in the HOA meeting hall buzzed faintly, the sound merging with the low murmur of voices. Sarah sat rigidly in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs, her fingers tightening around the stack of papers in her lap. Mark sat beside her, his face carved from stone, his body still but coiled with tension. Across from them, lounging in a cushioned seat at the head of the table like she was royalty, sat Karen Weller. She was smiling. The kind of smile that wasn't meant to soothe or welcome but to taunt. The kind of smile that said she had already won before the battle had even begun. Sarah cleared her throat and stood. We've gathered signatures from 72 residents, she began, holding up the papers. They support restoring the bench for Ethan. Many of them use the park daily and they all agree. Karen cut her off with a dramatic sigh, resting her chin in her hand. Mrs. Larkin, let me stop you right there. Sarah bristled. It's Ms. Larkin. Karen's smirk widened. Ms. Larkin then. While I deeply sympathize with your loss, she said in a tone that suggested she did no such thing, I think you're failing to understand the rules here. The HOA board, not random petitioners, decides what stays and what goes. Mark leaned forward, his voice dangerously calm. Then put it to a vote. Karen folded her hands together in mock thoughtfulness. Oh, I would, but you see, HOA bylaws state that only board members have a vote on structural changes to community spaces. And unfortunately for you, the board is quite happy with the park exactly as it is. A ripple of murmurs moved through the room. Some of the board members glanced at each other uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. Sarah's heart pounded against her ribs. That bench was hurting no one, she said, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. It wasn't in anyone's way, it wasn't violating any safety codes. It was just there, a place for people to sit, to reflect, to honor a child who was taken too soon. Karen sighed again, dramatically, as if she were growing exhausted with all this sentimentality. As I said before, it sets a precedent. If we allow this, then suddenly everyone will want to erect their own little projects and shared spaces. I mean, what's next? A shrine? A statue? A fountain? She rolled her eyes. Besides, we all know how these things go. It would start out nice, sure, but then it would become an eyesore. Flowers, stuffed animals, plaques everywhere. And do you know what that does to property values? Mark's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood, hands braced on the table. His voice was steel. You trashed a memorial for a dead child over property values? Karen's expression didn't waver. If anything, she looked amused. Now, don't be so dramatic. It's just a bench. Sarah's vision blurred with rage. She wanted to scream at this woman, to wipe that smug expression off her face with the sheer force of her grief and fury. But she forced herself to swallow it down. She wouldn't give Karen the satisfaction of watching her break. Karen pushed back from the table and smoothed down her blazer. I think that about covers everything. If there's nothing else. You're making a mistake, Mark said coldly. You might think you've won, but you haven't. Karen chuckled. Oh, Mr. Larkin. This isn't a contest. I'm simply enforcing the rules. She gestured toward the door. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a very busy schedule. The meeting adjourned. Karen strode out, flanked by a few of her more loyal board members, while the rest of the room emptied in hushed conversation. Some neighbors offered Sarah and Mark sympathetic glances, but none of them stayed long. Mark and Sarah walked to their car in silence. The night air was crisp, the stars overhead indifferent to their suffering. Sarah's hands curled into fists. She enjoys this, she muttered. Mark didn't respond right away. He simply unlocked the car and slid into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened. She thinks we'll let it go. Sarah let out a hollow laugh. She wants us to. She wants us to feel small and powerless. Mark started the engine, the headlights cutting through the dark. Then let's show her how wrong she is. Sarah turned to him, her breath catching. There was something new in his voice, not just anger but purpose. A plan was forming. One that Karen Weller would never see coming. The next morning, Sarah stood at the edge of the empty park, hands buried deep in her jacket pockets. The place looked different now. Colder. Bare. The absence of Ethan's bench was a cruel reminder of what had been stolen from them. But as she glanced around, she saw something else, quiet rebellion brewing beneath the surface. Mrs. Dunlap stood on her porch, watching. A couple of neighborhood kids kicked a ball near where the bench used to be, their parents close by, whispering amongst themselves. People cared, they were just afraid to act. But fear had never stopped Sarah before. She turned as Mark approached, his stride purposeful, his jaw set. He handed her a cup of coffee, but his eyes burned with something sharper than exhaustion. It's time, he said. Sarah nodded. Let's do this. That afternoon they got to work. Mark had spent hours digging through city records, HOA guidelines, and legal loopholes. What he found was a single golden thread, one that, if pulled just right, could unravel everything Karen had done. It started with a simple post on the neighborhood's private online forum. Sarah uploaded a picture of the empty space where Ethan's bench had stood, along with a caption that was carefully crafted, calm, measured, but impossible to ignore. Asterisk, last night, our son's memorial was destroyed without warning. Some of you may have seen it happen. Some of you may have even felt powerless to stop it. But here's something the HOA doesn't want you to know. Our community has a voice. And we're about to use it. Asterisk. Then she dropped the bombshell. Asterisk, according to the city's public space ordinances, neighborhood parks belong to the residents. not the HOA board. Any structure removal must be brought to a community vote. Karen and her team broke that rule. Asterisk. The response was immediate. Comments flooded in. Outrage. People who had been silent at the meeting now had something to say. Asterisk. Wait, so they weren't even allowed to do this? Asterisk. Asterisk. I thought this was HOA approved. Are you telling me Karen just decided this on her own? Asterisk. Asterisk. Enough. We need to do something about this. Asterisk. By the time the sun set, the neighborhood was buzzing. Someone started a petition to reinstate the bench, this time with public backing. Another neighbor dug up emails where Karen had denied their requests for improvements, despite using HOA funds for her own home renovations. And then the floodgates opened. People began sharing their own stories of Karen's overreach. The time she fined the Johnsons for their flower boxes, the way she harassed the Petersons over their fence color, how she once threatened to tow an elderly woman's car for being parked an inch over her driveway line. It wasn't just about a bench anymore. It was about Karen's reign of unchecked power. The next day Mark took it one step further. He contacted the local news. By evening, a segment aired featuring their story. Sarah and Mark stood in front of the empty space where the bench once was, telling Ethan's story. The camera panned to the signatures piling up on their petition. A few neighbors spoke out, their voices cracking with anger. The final shot? Karen, refusing to answer the reporter's questions as she stormed into her house, slamming the door behind her. That was when everything changed. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, the community hall was packed. More people showed up than ever before. Neighbors who had never attended, parents with their kids in tow, elderly residents who had lived in the neighborhood longer than Karen had ruled over it. She sat at the head of the table, her smile noticeably absent. Sarah and Mark took their seats near the front. Karen cleared her throat, gripping the microphone. Let's call this meeting to order. I motion for a community vote, Mark interrupted, his voice carrying over the room. Karen stiffened. That's not how this works, Mr. Larkin. The HOA board makes these decisions. Actually, Sarah said, standing, that's not entirely true. The city ordinance states that any major structural removal in shared public spaces requires community consent. She turned to the crowd. Which means you get to decide. The room erupted. People shouted over one another, some furious, others emboldened. The board members glanced at each other nervously, their usual deference to Karen cracking under the pressure. Karen tried to regain control. This is highly inappropriate. No, what's inappropriate, Mark cut in, is the way you've been making unilateral decisions, misusing HOA funds, and bullying this neighborhood into submission. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. And then the final blow. A neighbor stood up, holding his phone. I did some digging, he said. Turns out Karen's been allocating HOA money illegally, renovating her backyard under the guise of neighborhood improvements. Gasps filled the room. Karen paled. That's a ridiculous accusation. It's not, the man said, holding up his screen. It's all here. Expenses don't match up. And I know the city would love to take a look at these numbers. Silence. Then a voice from the back, steady, strong. I vote to reinstate the bench. One by one, hands rose. First a few. Then dozens. Then nearly the entire room. Karen could do nothing but watch as her grip on power slipped through her fingers. Karen's face had drained of color. She looked from the sea of raised hands to the stunned board members beside her, searching for an escape, an ally, a way to twist this moment back in her favor. But there was none. The people she had ruled over with an iron grip had finally turned against her. Sarah watched the realization dawn in Karen's eyes, the slow, creeping horror of a woman who had spent years wielding power without question, now facing the undeniable truth. She had lost. A moment of silence stretched through the hall, thick with anticipation. Then Mark spoke. Since the community has voted, he said, voice unwavering, I believe the next step is clear. The bench will be reinstated. Applause erupted, neighbors clapping, some even cheering. But Sarah wasn't done. She stepped forward, her voice carrying above the noise. There's something else we need to address. The room quieted, eyes shifting toward her. She turned to Karen. You violated the trust of this community. You spent our dues on personal projects, ignored the voices of the people who actually live here, and weaponized the HOA to serve your own interests. She folded her arms. You are unfit to lead. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She had always been quick with a cutting remark, a dismissive scoff. But now, surrounded by a room full of people who had finally seen through her, she had nothing. I motion for Karen Weller's removal from the HOA board, Mark said loud and clear. I second, someone called out. Then another. And another. Karen shot to her feet, knocking over her chair. You can't do this, she snapped, voice trembling. I have served this community for years. I have sacrificed. Sacrificed what? A voice interrupted from the back. Our money? Our trust. Karen whirled toward the speaker, but she couldn't argue. The documents exposing her misuse of HOA funds were already spreading like wildfire. Even if she tried to fight back, the city would be looking into her soon enough. The vote stands, one of the other board members said, sounding more relieved than anything. All in favor of removing Karen Weller as HOA president? Hands shot up. Karen's fingers clenched into fists at her sides, shaking. But there was nothing left to say. It's over, Sarah said quietly, meeting her eyes. For the first time, Karen had no power. No leverage. She was just another homeowner now, stripped of the authority she had lorded over them for so long. And she knew it. Without another word, she grabbed her purse, turned on her heel, and stormed out. The front doors slammed shut behind her. A slow exhale rippled through the room, like the entire neighborhood was releasing a collective breath they hadn't realized they were holding. Then a new sound, applause. Not for Karen's exit, but for the victory they had just claimed. Neighbors turned to Sarah and Mark, voices overlapping. We did it. She's finally gone. When's the bench going back up? Mark smiled, glancing at Sarah. Tomorrow. The next morning the air was crisp and fresh, the scent of damp grass clinging to the early sunlight. It was the perfect day for a new beginning. Sarah stood in the park, watching as volunteers, neighbors who had once been silent but now stood beside them, helped carry the new memorial bench into place. A few kids peeked around the adults, giggling as they ran through the grass, their laughter filling the space with warmth. Mark tightened a bolt on the bench, then stood, wiping his hands. He looked at Sarah, something unspoken passing between them. They had won. Not just for themselves. Not just for Ethan. For everyone. Mrs. Dunlap shuffled over, leaning on her cane, her usual sharp gaze softened. It's a good thing you two did here, she said gruffly. Sarah smiled. It wasn't just us. The old woman nodded. No, but you started it. She glanced at the bench, then patted Sarah's arm before turning away. More people arrived throughout the morning, families, couples, even former skeptics. Some brought flowers, placing them gently on the bench. Others simply sat, soaking in the victory. And then, just as Sarah thought the moment couldn't be more perfect, a group of parents wheeled in something unexpected. A slide. Then a small swing set. And before she knew it, the empty space where Ethan's bench had once stood wasn't just restored, it was transformed. A playground. Sarah covered her mouth, eyes stinging. She turned to Mark, who shook his head, smiling. They said if Karen was going to complain about taking up space, he gestured to the growing playground, they might as well really make it worth it. Laughter bubbled from Sarah's chest, light and free. Karen had tried to erase something beautiful. But in the end, all she had done was inspire something even greater. And Ethan's memory would never be taken away again.